Listen up, get ready, I'm not gonna take no more. There's a revolution, a revelation going on in my soul. Buckle up, get ready, we're not gonna...
We're back with more live from the Heartland for the week of August 13th. We are recording this on the 9th of August. And my friend Rus Bradburd, who's been a longtime contributor to the show, many of you out there listening or viewing know that he is an author, a former basketball coach, a basketball announcer. He played at Von Steuben High School. He's out of the South Shore originally. And he went on to North Park College. They had a championship team. He ended up coaching at University of Texas, El Paso, then a little bit later at New Mexico State, where he is now a professor of English, I believe. And he is the author of a number of books, most recently, All the Dreams We've Dreamed, the saga of Sean Harrington, the Marshall coach who was wounded in a drive-by shooting. Rus, it's great to see you again. It hasn't been too long since we ran into each other. Actually, I'll tell the viewers, the listeners, you were on the front porch this morning. And
I love the front porch. It's sort of the center of the universe in Rogers Park anymore with the closing of the Heartland Cafe.
You took a ride by the Heartland, I understand, on your bike on your way home.
It wasn't as depressing and ugly as I thought it was going to be, but maybe I'll change my tune at some point. Yeah,
well, if I win the lottery and an old man, I'd help open a new place. But right now, we're doing some writing, and you are a writer, and you've been over in Ireland with your family for a little bit, working on your latest book, In the Works. And it's basically about migrants, immigrants, asylum seekers, whatever they're called over there, who are learning to play Gaelic football, etc. Fill us in.
Well, I went over on a Fulbright fellowship a year ago. I got very interested in this phenomenon in the age of Brexit. Your listeners and viewers would know this, but the Brexit was, the United Kingdom leaving the European Union, and much of it seemed very obviously fueled by anti-immigrant sentiment. And Northern Ireland is just 4% of the UK's population, but they get 21% of the immigrants. The people in Belfast seem to love it. I'm sure what the Brits think is that it's a dumping ground. But in the midst of this anti-immigrant sentiment, there's been an influx of Syrian refugees, Sudanese refugees, and lately, in the last year, of course, Ukrainian refugees. And so, but there's a strange phenomenon going on. There's a traditional Irish sport called Gaelic football and one called hurling. And they're complicated to explain, except for that, but they're longtime traditional Irish sports. They're hardly played anywhere else in the world, although there is Gaelic Park in Chicago where it gets played. But it's, of course, the epicenter is Ireland, and it's a traditional Irish sport. But what's happening now is that the immigrant children are getting funneled into these Gaelic sports. The mom and dad moved there from a troubled area, and they think, I've got to do something with my kids. And Gaelic football and hurling has been very welcoming to children. So the example I use, maybe, Michael, is if say, for example, if your grandfather came over from Germany in 1950 or whatever, that he would maybe he didn't grow up playing baseball, but he'd stick you as a new American kid. He would stick you into the Little League program. So I found this phenomenon that these people are fleeing this terrible violence, the Syrians and the Ukrainians and the Sudanese. But it's not just that they're fleeing the violence, but the men running these Gaelic football clubs often have this violence in their rearview mirror because either they participated or were affected by the violence due to the Troubles, which the Good Friday Agreement ended in 1998. And so many of the people involved in Gaelic sports have, like everyone in Belfast, has a complicated background. And it's a little bit like, similar to that I found out when writing about Sean Harrington in All the Dreams We've Dreamed. Just anytime I interviewed somebody on the West Side, they had been badly affected by gun violence. If it wasn't a good friend or a neighbor, it was a cousin or a guy across the street. And it's so we have a whole generation of traumatized. Well, in Belfast, there's a whole generation of older people, particularly older men, that have been traumatized, but now they're the ones welcoming in the immigrants particularly from Syria and the Ukraine.
Well, that's good. That's a good rundown. And you, as an author, uh, you cranked out some really nice books, and I'm glad that I got to be a part of your patio on the hardwood and take some pictures for you. I always look forward to reading whatever you write. What are you reading, though? Why don't we turn this into a little bit of a book review session, and with Rus Bradburd being the commentator.
Well, I'm very interested in I know a lot more about Ireland than most Americans, but I still got a very long way to go. And so I've been reading the nonfiction books of a man named Miles Dungan. It's like Duncan, but with a G instead. And Miles is Myles. He's a Irish historian that's often writing about the sort of the crossover between America and Ireland. So I got very interested in Irish history through this Miles Dungan. I was always vaguely interested, but Miles really brings it to life. And then I'm reading maybe my favorite journalist in Northern Ireland is a man named Malachy Doherty, who's written a dozen or more books, but he's also a columnist, and he's both loved and reviled. He's a little like Mike Royko, where it's hard not to get mad at him. But I think he's really brilliant. And so his new book is called How to Fix Northern Ireland, which is a complicated and nuanced view. But he's become a good friend. His wife is a poet, Maureen Boyle, who's one of the top poets in Northern Ireland. So it fits in well with our family, with my wife Connie Voisine being a noted poet here in America. And then as far as fiction, I loved a book called Trespasses by Louise Kennedy. And that got re-released in America. It was originally published in Ireland, but it's a novel set in Belfast in maybe the 1980s, I guess. And then also going down to the Republic, of course, we know that Northern Ireland is not technically part of Ireland, although it might be someday in our lifetimes. But then from the Republic, from the Free State down in the South, there's a writer who will be no surprise to your listeners who read books, Claire Keegan. I think is just really brilliant. And I'd say Claire Keegan, she might be 50 years old. Of course, she's still writing today, but her short story, which she called Foster, won the Academy Award as a feature film for Irish language, for foreign language films. It's in Irish, what we sometimes call Gaelic, but is really incorrect. It's Irish. And she won her film, or the film based on her short story, is called The Quiet Girl. And it's a brilliant film, and the book is even better. And when I say the book, it's only 90 pages. It's an easy read. So I love Claire Keegan. And the other long short story that I read, it's a novella, I suppose. It's called Small Things Like These, which is a novel sort of based loosely on what happened with the Magdalene sisters. They were the crew that, if you were a young girl and got pregnant in Ireland until fairly recently, they stuck you off with the Magdalene sisters. You had the baby, and they took the baby, put it up for adoption, and you got stuck working in a laundry for the rest of your life. And so it was, Sinead O'Connor, who just died, had been, I don't know if she had a baby out of wedlock, so to speak, but I think that she got put in for being a troublemaker. You could get put in for being a troublemaker. Of course, we know Sinead O'Connor is one of the world's great troublemakers.
She was.
And by the way, of course, I was living in Belfast when Sinead O'Connor died, and it was just really dominant. I mean, it would have been like Elvis dying here or that kind of thing. It was really dominated the media for a couple of days, and she was a really gutsy and courageous. She gave up commercial success to stand up for what she believed in, and I imagine most of the listeners of your show would be, down with that.
Let me ask you a little bit about Cormac McCarthy, who was living in El Paso. And I know when I first came to El Paso, you took me by his house. And I want to know if you ever met him, but do you have anything you want to share about him? Talk about some gruesome stuff.
Well, his writing was gruesome. I don't think he was personally gruesome, but
no, I meant his writing.
McCarthy left El Paso, I think, in the early 1990s or maybe mid 1990s to go live in Santa Fe. He got married again and had a son, but he lived I only lived a few hundred yards away from him when I lived in El Paso, And but I never met him, and it was known, even though I loved his books by the early 90s, was sort of very into him, and he was my favorite writer for a long time, and he's still right up there at the top. But it was known, everyone in El Paso knew that you don't go ring his doorbell and try and talk to him, that he was extremely private and that he didn't want to be bothered. And so I never, not that I probably would have been afraid to do it anyway, but yeah, like a lot of writers, I would have liked to have met him, but never did. But I know people who know him. And he got somehow tied in with a lefty lawyer in El Paso named Malcolm McGregor, who'd been one of the only progressives in the Texas Senate back in the 1960s. He sort of got tied in with, although I don't think Cormac would have been hard to pin down politically. I think, I won't say any more about it because I think it's sort of, I don't want to talk like I knew him, but yeah, I know people that knew him, and the word with them was, oh no, you could talk to him, and he was talking, but he didn't want to talk about his own books. And if he thought that you were sort of if you wanted something from him, that he would sort of run the other way. And if he got recognized in the bookstore, he went to the bookstores every month, I guess, and picked out books and bought them. But if he got recognized, he just hightailed it and left. And so he would actually come to the bookstore in Mesilla, New Mexico. And I know the lady who owns the place, and one of my students was working there. And she said the same thing, that he was friendly and he'd buy the books and he'd ask for recommendations. And if people said, oh, aren't you Cormac McCarthy? He was out the door. But I think he's a brilliant writer, and he depicts a pretty gruesome or difficult part of American history. And my favorite books, I love the trilogy, particularly the first two, All the Pretty Horses and The Crossing.
Yeah, I remember reading those. Blood Meridian was a rough one to read for me.
Yeah, it's a brilliant book, but it's extremely violent.
Russ, I know you're packing, you're getting ready. You came back from Ireland. You visited your family in Philadelphia. You're here in Chicago for another day. You're leaving with your family, driving back to Las Cruces and El Paso. Let me just ask you, do you have anything rumbling around in that wonderful brain of yours about what book you're going to do after this next one comes out? I mean, you must have some plans and things you're thinking about.
I don't. Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. It seems like each time that I've written a nonfiction book, the story sort of stumbles into my lap. Nolan Richardson showed up at Basketball in the Barrio, and I thought somebody should write a book about it, because everyone was blaming him and calling it reverse racism. And
about Arkansas, when he was coaching at Arkansas?
Yeah, when he got fired, he pretty universally got blamed by just every single media source I read, and I mean there were dozens of them, that said he deserved to get fired, and it was his own fault, and that he's seeing racism where there wasn't racism. I wanted to undercut that story and get a sort of a more accurate and complicated. And I should probably say that Nolan Richardson's not 100% happy with the book. There's parts of the book that even today he disagrees with. But it seems like the nonfiction stuff just has fallen in my lap. So it's hard to predict what will fall in my lap. I do have a novel that, if there's any publishers listening, I do have if I do have a novel, a satire that I think is pretty good, that I'm looking for a home for, and I think I'm going to try and get an Irish publisher for this Gaelic, the Syrian refugees playing Gaelic football book. It just seems like it's more. I just think it's a nuanced enough story, and I hate to say this, I just don't know if the American audience is smart enough. Not that I'm that brilliant, but I don't know if I have to explain the troubles in Northern Ireland and Brexit and what's going on in Syria and what's going on in the Ukraine and how Gaelic football works. It might be too much for an American. Yet a book that I really admired was there's a book called Outcast United about these refugee kids playing on the same soccer team in rural Georgia. And I think the author is Warren St. John. And I thought that was a really good book. And so in some ways, but actually, Mike, the real model, maybe I talked about this last time, forgive me, but Alex Kotlowitz is I've met Alex. I wouldn't say, I wish I could call him a friend, but he's a friendly acquaintance. And I really admired his last book is called An American Summer. And it's about gun violence in Chicago, but he traces the gun violence in 7 or 8 different stories. And that if you go into it thinking there's one hero to root for, so he's able to do that. And I think for my book in Belfast, there's not any one person who's the hero of the book. It's just I'm trying to get across a larger picture. So I'm a big admirer of Alex Kotlowitz, and I'm hoping that if I was a tenth of the writer Alex Kotlowitz was and could capture Belfast and this strange moment of Brexit and Syrians and Gaelic football, I'll be happy.
Well, Rus Bradburd, I'm thinking of more things to ask you, but we want to have you back on, and I know you got to get ready. I want to say I'm glad that you're my friend, and you impart a lot of great information for people everywhere. And I hope that book that you, that secret novel that you have, which I believe has to do with athletic departments having a lot of power, taking over universities.
Yeah, it's a satire, but you know, which I think hits home with Northwestern and everybody else. But it's harder to get fiction published, and I'm really focused on this nonfiction project now.
All right. Well, safe travels to you and to Connie and Alma. I love you, brother. Thanks a lot.
God bless the Heartland Cafe, and thanks to Katie, and tell Paige thank you for that lovely tomato sandwich.
Okay, brother. We'll see you.
Okay.